Hi, I'm El. You're listening to 1.5 Degrees, wherever podcasts are sold. This week we're going to be talking about fantasy. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to our podcast. This is 1.5 Degrees. The meaning behind the title is there's three of us on this podcast. We all study joint honours film and television, with there being three of us, 1.5 degrees. My name's Stu. I've recently watched The Irishman at the cinema. Very long film. I know it's now on Netflix. Quite enjoyable. I like gangster films, postmodern science fiction films, action thrillers, and generally a little bit of everything as well. How about you, El? What have you been watching recently?
Hi, I'm El. I've just finished watching the season 1 and only season of the Watchmen TV show. I'm a big fan of sort of societal discussions within film and television. I'm a big fan of postmodern theory, and I'm a big fan of just overall exploring these different concepts which we do in our daily lives. What about you, Matt?
So I'm Matt. I'm a big fan of the fantasy genre. I've just got done watching the first season of The Witcher, and you know it's a pretty good adaptation of a book. Other than that, I'm a fan of science fiction. A bit of a postmodern sci-fi guy, especially with Blade Runner. But done that a lot in uni. So yeah, it's got to be my favourite.
Sounds good. We're looking for just doing a chill, relaxed discussion. We'll have weekly topics, and we will, we'll hopefully you keep listening.
We'll be exploring some theories and questions in the latest news of film and television, latest topics that may come up every now and again, as well as historical questions that surround film and TV, just to get some open-ended questions and some theories and answers and opinions, really. So that's it.
So our first episode, we're going to be looking at the fantasy dominance in television. We're going to look into how the popularity that it's gotten in the last decade or so. We're going to maybe talk about Game of Thrones. More recently, we're going to look into the new Witcher series. I definitely did say fantasy, not fantasy.
Yeah, that's right. We get that right.
And so what do any of you guys want to pick up from? Why do you think fantasy's become such a heavy hitter on television? Following from the biggest fantasy thing, sort of like 10, maybe 15 years ago, was Lord of the Rings in film.
Yeah,
and it's never really translated well in TV from the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
But then as soon as we get to 2010, Game of Thrones comes out, and that's a big hit on HBO. So why do you think that is?
For me, I think it's just adaptation. I think when the stories are written often in a novelist format, and then they get put onto TV, which is a platform that can be utilized almost endlessly, because with a film you are restricted. Even with the Lord of the Rings, you're restricted to so much that you can have within 3 2-hour slots, and then of course again in The Hobbit, whereas a television show of something like that has the ability to just expand characters and storylines and stuff. And I think that for TV to adapt fantasy, because there's so much lore in terms of places, all these locations, the different names, I get lost in them personally with quite a lot of them. But I think that compartmentally a film is better for that. But in terms of just exploring, it's the same with a video game. You can move into video game territory from a book. The Lord of the Rings video games have expanded from the books massively in that example, and I'm assuming the same with something like The Witcher, despite the fact that I haven't played the games or read the books. Loved the show though.
Me too.
Yeah. I think it's just adaptation from storybook, really.
So I mean, let's go to the past with fantasy. Let's go to, I think we all agree that sort of the best time for fantasy was the 80s, when we have Highlander, when we have classic, just all
Highlander.
These things. Well, the problem with fantasy is that you have to suspend cool. You have to suspend fun and cool. You can't have a lot of fun with fantasy because it would make it less serious. And the problem with fantasy, it kind of has to be serious. It has to justify being set in a magical world, so it has to create these big sweeping narratives. And when you're doing that, it's hard to have fun and look cool doing it. I mean, Lord of the Rings, fantastic, operatic, amazing, Oscar-winning performances. But there's only like Merry and Pippin and sometimes, Gimli and Legolas that actually get to do something fun and enjoyable and have like quips and fun in that.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what changed after, the past 10 years with, say, Game of Thrones. We have characters like, the Tyrion guy who's like drinks and swears and makes stupid comments, and we have a lot of that in the show, but we also have the seriousness. So it's about sort of adapting these relatable personalities, these relatable tropes into something that's, hoity-toity fantasy, for example. I mean, this is what The Witcher does as well. Like, it's just, everyone, look at the memes online, everyone's just saying fuck, because Geralt is like, fuck. Like, that is, and I think that's really relatable, and I think looking at that. But if we have that without it, the show loses its appeal to the sort of mainstream audience.
Yeah, you don't want... I think it's better, in terms of Game of Thrones, you don't want, a stereotypical good guy or a bad guy. You want those great characters that are more relatable. You can, let's go with Jaime Lannister. He's a complete dick in season 1.
Yeah.
And then, he goes through he gets his hand cut off, and then that's it. You feel sorry for him. Straight from there, he's peak bad guy. Then he becomes a very likable character because he loses something very dear, and then that makes him more human. He becomes more human, not just a bad guy.
So you think maybe it's more about these like individual getting to know these characters better, making them more human instead of having these kings in armor going for freedom and glory. I think they even say that in The Witcher, don't they? There's even that character that's like, for freedom and glory, and he just chops that poor defenseless animal up because he thinks he's doing something right, because it's playing to these tropes of like, I'm a fantasy character, I can't be
the classic prince impressing the woman. He tries to impress Yennefer.
And that's a really good like divergent of like where the show says, we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to be what but we're going to do it in a new setting, and we're going to explore these complex grey areas of morality in society. And I think that's what Game of Thrones does as well, and I think that's what good fantasy is exploring these complex ideas in something that's so far removed from reality.
Yeah, it explores characters that are quite stereotypical, I think, of that genre. That there is still the hero's journey, but then there are a lot of groups, because these fantasy series that we've mentioned are based around like factions, especially with Game of Thrones, which is the overall point of it, isn't it?
You've got your different houses,
different ideologies.
So every sort of character in there does follow these different paths. You've got these people that are naturally sort of evil, with Cersei Lannister and with her brother Jaime, and then you take on the role of someone like Jon Snow, who's more of a kind of somber hero that is the
like the traditional stoic hero.
But he's mysterious. He's supposed to be that kind of, who is this elusive figure and what is his purpose at the start, and then he gets that character development. And I think that's where, when we talk about how fantasy has progressed in television, it's this idea of character development, because you are following the characters. When people have discussions about any television genre, it's always, who's your favorite character? Who's your least favorite? Who do you think is going to interact? It's always about the characters. Things like location, storyline, and then technical factors such as sound editing, camera work, and cinematography are put aside because there is a heavy drive on plot and character. And then things like action sequence. Like, do you guys think that fantasy TV shows have to be around action? Because things like Game of Thrones and The Witcher especially The Witcher, have a lot of action because people have this pre-established kind of knowledge of what The Witcher is about because of things like the video games.
Well, I'd answer that with another question. I would say if The Witcher's direction of action wasn't so good, would it be a lesser TV show by far? Would we still enjoy it the same? Because I don't go into fantasy looking for action. I think it's just a nice surprise when they do it so well, like Game of Thrones did sometimes, and you got these like in between movies, like you got the last. The Nicolas Cage one where he
the season of the
Witch.
Oh yeah.
You get all these like in between movies, and the action's never really particularly good. But because you have these like famous actors doing it, it becomes a bit more fun to watch for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd follow on with the Witcher, especially with going back to that the idea of it if it's a lesser fantasy show or just a lesser show in general because of the because if it has terrible action, it's a lesser show. But wouldn't you say that because it's got like a pre-established audience already from the video games or for the books, the fact that it's already got an audience, doesn't that, or wouldn't you say that makes it a higher show already because it's got an already fan base there?
It puts it on a pedestal, absolutely, but it can go either way from that point. The Witcher was very lucky, the TV show was lucky in terms of the way that it landed on its feet. It really hit the ground running.
How did that? Like, who said yes to that decision? Because they're the luckiest person in the world. Can you imagine? Like, okay, so it's 2019. You're a Netflix guy, or I don't know where the show was. Maybe it's probably Netflix. You're a Netflix guy. Your job is just to say yes to stuff. And looking at Netflix, you've done that a lot. So you get a guy walking in, and he's got a script. I'm going to make a TV adaptation of a video game. How consciously, looking at the past, look what's been done, look at Prince of Persia, look at Tomb Raiders, stuff like that. How do you look at that script and and not immediately go no?
Well, that's where it's interesting because they've, as far as I'm aware, they did take some elements of the video games, throw it into this series, but primarily they've taken the
story from the books.
The story from the books as the main source. And I think naturally there is this stigma around adapting video game storylines, which is one of our future podcasts, which we will discuss.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah. The showrunner for that, Lauren Hisrich Schmid, I believe her name is. She, I can't even remember the rest of the content that she's produced up until now, but she was very careful with the adaptation of that, which is where it led into the casting and believability. And I'm sure you guys are aware of the lengths that Henry Cavill went to get that role of Geralt of Rivia. The moment they announced that show, Henry Cavill had pestered Netflix day in, day out to get that role, and the reason is because he was a fan of the video games first. He played The Witcher 3 Wild Hunts to death. Then he found out that they were based on these short stories and these books, which he then read in their entirety, and after that he was so enveloped within Geralt that he believed himself that no one else could play that role. And then Lauren Hisrich Schmidt said that he was the perfect choice. And this is where I think the watchability of him comes in, because again, you may or may not know, his choreography was performed by himself. He had no stuntman.
Yeah. That's brilliant, by the way.
And that is amazing. Now, this is where we come to the question of, and this is a question that's been around the news and media, leading on from my action question. Do you guys think that the choreography in The Witcher surpasses or matches the choreography, action and fight scenes in Game of Thrones?
No.
Why is that?
Because it doesn't really go to the physical choreography. It goes to the way it's shot, and it goes to the scale and scope. So sometimes they were a bit like. So if you take sort of let's say the Battle of Blackwater for Game of Thrones, let's go to season 4.
Season
2, where you've got Tyrion Lannister in the pitch black fighting against these sort of people, and he gives this great speech, and he goes out and fights them. The fights that we see there are not particularly impressive. It's the context of the situation that's impressive.
Yeah.
There's a big war going on in the background. We're not impressed to see Tyrion swinging an axe. I know it's kind of impressive because he's kind of a short dude, but
and it's shot really dark as well.
Yeah, there's that as well, and that's a Game of Thrones thing I'd like to throw something at. So I mean, like, you've got Tyrion swinging an axe. He does a decent job, and then he gets attacked by some dude. That's not on paper, and it's not visually necessarily impressive when you look at other fantasy or look at anything with sword fighting or even Star Wars. What's impressive is the scale and scope and the attachment you've got to the situation. What's impressive is that you've got all these people running around the background that are not play acting. They're proper, they're doing it really good. Where The Witcher, don't get me wrong, Henry Cavill, I think it was really good what he did with the character and the physicality and stuff like that. I haven't got an issue with that. I've got an issue with the fight scenes were very low scale, and when they were shot with a lot of cuts. They were shot with a lot of quick swings, quick movements, stuff like that, and that was good. Like the first fight scene in the first episode, excellent. He takes out a couple dudes. It looks very real. It feels very real. Very Game of Thronesy, I'll say that. But then the fight comes to an end, and that's kind of just it.
Yeah.
What about the fight with Renfrey at the end of the first episode?
See, I really enjoyed that. And
do you think it was impressive? It was enjoyable. I've got no problem with it.
I think it was very entertaining.
It's not memorable though. Is it?
It's not what it's not. Like I'm going to refer to Game of Thrones for this fight. It's not as impressive as when you see in season 5 when you see Jon Snow fight the White Walker for the first time.
Right, you get fear. You get real fear because it's been set up. Well, all we've learnt about Renfrey throughout the entire episode is that it's bad. It eats people. It killed one Witcher, and that's okay. That's the setup. That's the threat.
Mm-hmm.
It killed a Witcher. That we know from the show. We know from the context. That's something. But what we don't get is stats. With Game of Thrones, it's like it's set up that the White Walkers are the death of humanity.
Yeah, they're the ultimate
very much
threat.
so. I mean, let's look at that played out. Such a massive
if
threat.
You didn't notice that there is some sort of like there's hostility.
There's hostility towards Game of Thrones. We'll get to that. But the fight with the Renfrey, it was fun. I enjoyed it. None of this is a criticism. But your question was, is it Game of Thrones level? No. No, and I don't think it's a budget issue. I do not think it's an acting or physicality issue. I think it is simply a directing issue. I think
this is a natural part of where we are in terms of the year, with the biggest fantasy TV show finishing, and then what people have pegged as the new big thing hitting Netflix, which everyone has and everyone's seen, and it's become this most popular show and fastest riser ever. So I think naturally it is being compared, despite the fact that it shouldn't in every aspect. There are things like the choreography and the costume design, acting level that you could compare. But
maybe the CG.
Well,
I have an issue,
but not the overall story.
I have an issue with the entire premise of, is it the new Game of Thrones? Yes, Game of Thrones was a massive cultural phenomenon. Yes, Game of Thrones earns this massive, even with the ending, earns this massive moniker of the big one, right? It's before Game of Thrones, it was probably Breaking Bad, right? Which also earned it. But I think people are saying The Witcher is the new Game of Thrones not because it's as good or less good or whatever, or more as popular. They're saying it because it's fantasy.
Yeah. If the Amazon Prime Lord of the Rings TV show was out instead of The Witcher, they'd be comparing it to Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
In that style, I think.
Yeah.
That this is the new Game of Thrones, but at the same time, I don't know. I think it's had a difference. I think actually using Lord of the Rings comparison's a bit iffy, I think, because then you'd be comparing it to the films and then so forth like that. Which
is what inevitably will happen when that series comes out, because those films are so well regarded.
Is the new Lord of the Rings the new Lord of the Rings? Is that going to be the question? Is that sort of,
You can see that article now.
But yeah, I think you mentioned they shouldn't be compared, but they're two different entities and should probably be left alone with that I'm referring to the Lord of the Rings in particular, that the show and the film, they'll inevitably be compared and beaten to death with articles about that.
And that's part of the media hype. I mean, there will be articles. Is this new Gandalf as good as the old Gandalf? Is this new Frodo? Is this new Smaug? Is this new Tom Bombadil?
Look at what Ian McKellen says about the new Gandalf.
Yeah. So what about, like, if we've spoke about sort of the fantasy genre in terms of period pieces, what about fantasy on television with regards to sci-fi? So I know we've spoke a lot about The Mandalorian before. Elle, I know you've watched all of it.
Fantastic. This is the way.
I've not seen it. Matt, you've not seen it?
Which one, sorry?
The Mandalorian.
No, I've not seen it.
So where does that kind of fit in with this idea of fantasy? I know, of course...
it's the new Game of Thrones.
It is the new Game of Thrones.
I would
Enough
like to,
said, folks.
I would just like to jump in. You know, when you was... going back to the showrunner for The Witcher.
Yeah.
I was just looking that as well as working on The Witcher, she's also been a producer on Daredevil.
There you go.
And The Defenders, Umbrella Academy.
Ooh.
So, there is some...
so we know who to thank for these ones.
So there is some, like, you can see... She has obviously worked in those sort of, fancy...
I'm on board with whatever she does next. I'm on board. This is a good showrunner for me.
Power as well. Yeah.
Power, really?
Yeah, she's a fairly up and comer by the looks of it. I mean, she's been doing this for about 10 years, but
good for her. She gets more jobs as she goes along.
Daredevil,
I think
rest in peace.
If she does, I think she'll be made if she does season 2 Witcher perfectly. I mean, I don't know if she's going to be working on anything else, but I feel like season 1 of The Witcher.
As long as there's no more time travel, I've got no problems. Because that was a critique I may have a little bit. It was like I went down. I was watching it, and my aunt was downstairs, and I came down, and like she was on episode 6 or 7, and she was like, is this set at different timelines?
Yeah, I have to admit I was very lost with that as well. It did take me like 2 episodes to kind of go back to linear time and say, oh, okay.
That is a...
I respect the attempt.
It's an interesting choice that they did that.
And I can see why they did it. And on repeat watching, it enables repeat watching. I'll say that. When repeat watching, you get these sentences like, oh, I feel like an idiot because you mentioned that woman in the first episode. But Queen Calanthe is mentioned by the thingy woman in the first episode. So it's like, oh, I'm an idiot. But no, get better, please. Yeah.
So what about then science fiction? Where does that kind of fit in with fantasy in terms of TV?
It's iffy. When I...
Well, think about the kind of the dominating aspect of it. The Mandalorian has been pegged as America's biggest show for a while now until The Witcher came out. Is that because of this, like we've said, the previous lore? Is that because of the interest in the actual character? I mean, everybody loves a bounty hunter in Star Wars.
It's because of one man, and it's John Favreau.
Star Wars burnout.
John Favreau is the sole reason why this show is any good whatsoever, and you can tell by watching it. There was one episode, I think, in the middle... Stuckman Reviews has the same critique where it just feels completely out of place and completely silly, and it's Jon Favreau. That's it. It really does really good with world building, story building, homages to previous movies, not just westerns, but there's an episode which directly takes the plot of The Seven Samurai, which is a Akira Kurosawa movie, and the way they do it, it's very obvious that they're doing it. It's an homage. It's not a rip-off.
Yeah,
it's just a really well done, slowed down, take your time piece. I think more than half the episodes themselves are filler, but it's completely worth watching, establishing this character. Pedro Pascal, the lead actor of The Mandalorian, does so much with the slightest head movements. It is unbelievable how much he does by just turning his head, by conveying his emotions. It's unbelievable the supporting cast it's got. You have Gina Carrera, is that the right?
Oh, yeah, Carrera.
Fantastic. And when you go to the actual socket of Baby Yoda, which not really a spoiler, it comes up in episode 1. The actual figure itself looks so real because it is real. They've used the model and stuff like that, and
prosthetics.
The prosthetic, and it works so well and doesn't get old. It just doesn't get old like CGI would. Even Taika Waititi voices a bounty hunter droid, and
is that IG?
The IG unit, yeah, that's right. It's just so
which
funny.
Is in A New Hope. Am I right?
It's not the same one, but
it's a different
do
model,
see
but it's part of one of those.
It's not in New Hope, it's in Empire Strikes Back, I think. You see,
when
you know,
the bounty hunters are lined
yeah,
up.
Yes,
Vader.
that's it.
So yeah, you see one of them, and it's
I remember seeing that in
and
the
there's so many
trailer.
calls back, like the Jawas are in it, and
Houdini.
they get funny. They get funnier than what we've ever seen them, and they're so interesting and real. Jon Favreau nailed it. I know I shouldn't be giving all the success to the cast, the supporting cast, and Jon Favreau. I know there's probably loads more people involved with it, and the writers, but when you watch it, this is what fantasy is. This is exactly what fantasy is. And I think part of the reason it dominates so heavily is because people didn't expect it to succeed. I mean, Star Wars right now, I mean...
It's dead now.
Even if you did...
Well,
because I liked...
Let's open this can of worms.
So I liked... Rise of Skywalker, is that the most recent one?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I liked Rise of Skywalker. I thought it was a good movie and a good way to end 2019 with just like this emotional win. Even if it had some missteps on the way there. Even if you don't like the movie, even if you hate the Star Wars franchise now, Star Wars is still very much here, and it's still very much got a shot, and it still does. I mean, we've got the
Clone Wars final season.
I'm looking forward to that.
We've got the Ben Kenobi movie coming out, the Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, the Disney
series,
Plus series.
Yeah. Although that yeah.
And
there's been some argument over whether that'll actually happen now.
Yeah, apparently there is some things going on. I can't remember where I read it, but I read something about Ewan McGregor is having difficulties with the writers or the producer or something like that.
That's a red flag. That is a red flag.
You know, you're in trouble when Obi-Wan disagrees with you.
When the guy,
Well, that's the thing though. Ewan McGregor has got a good enough status to argue whatever he wants with that now.
He has. I hope he gets his way.
He should know that character like the back of his hand.
He's been in great movies with good dialogue, and he knows what that is. I don't know the writers. I really hope there's a discussion between them and they listen to it. I mean, writing fantasy must be extremely difficult to toe that line of not going too far, not going too silly, not going too ridiculous, but also trying to keep the audience contained in this new world that we have no idea what it is, and also borrowing off from Star Wars lore, which we've mentioned before. It's not that expansive to try and get more than 10 movies out of, and a TV series out of, and a Clone Wars series out of. It's really difficult to create Star Wars content nowadays because expectations are so high still. I would say even after the movies, the expectations are so high.
Mm-hmm. Even with that, even though they Disney cut out the extended universe with all those novels and stuff, I feel like people still hold
worst
those.
idea ever.
I agree, and I feel like people are still using, even though they're not canon anymore, people are still using those as reference. They're still using those to heighten their expectation of a Star Wars movie or TV show.
It's a very difficult. I've got a question for you guys. If there's a new sci-fi, a new fantasy show coming out, do you immediately take that as a positive or a negative? If I've told you to watch here's a good show and it is fantasy,
as long as it's not Legend of the Seeker 2.
but like overall, what is? I mean, I know this has probably changed in the past 10 years, obviously because of Star Wars and Game of Thrones and The Witcher. But is fantasy necessarily something you're comfortable to dive right into?
Not as a new series. I don't think originally written fantasy television shows.
What's your immediate reaction if I say, here's this new fantasy show you've never heard of?
My immediate reaction is that unless this is based on something that I am even slightly aware of, I'm going to avoid it because I just don't think it'll be any good.
Why don't you think it'll be any good?
I think that fantasy, depending on whatever subgenre follow it, whether it be mystical or witchcraft and wizardry or swords and sandals or science fiction, there needs to be a story that I am aware of first to be able to apply to that series, because it helps me just understand it better.
Do you think overall then fantasy is maybe heavy? It's a heavy meal.
It's a lot to take on in one go if you're not aware of any previous lore. But then again, a lot of genre shows do that now, not necessarily fantasy. I mean, how many BBC dramas do we get which are completely original that end up being quite good? Look at The Bodyguard. That was a very good TV drama.
They did their own fantasy show, didn't they, for a while? What was it? The Last Kingdom? But that was...
I've heard of that.
I think that got bought out by Netflix at some point. But they started that fantasy show, and that built up pretty...
So what's your thoughts then, Matt, on... would you dive right into fantasy because you have a good relationship with it?
I think I would like to say yes, but my attraction to The Witcher was because I loved the video games, I loved the books. That's why I really believe that the show had a shot of being really well done. But I think if it's similar to what Stu said, I think if it's not something that I know of already, not based on something I know of already, I don't think I wouldn't. I think I'd struggle to jump into something straight away. I'd have to, I think I'd, I think, for example, I start, and it's not fantasy, for Altered Carbon, that took some persuasion on your part to get me to watch that.
Excellent show.
It was a very good show, and I loved that. But I think for me, I'd like I'd like a recommendation to watch it. To someone to explain to say to me this new fantasy show is good because, and that's when
peer influence is a massive thing for me as well with television. If there isn't that previous law that I'm aware of, like when Netflix eventually do this Resident Evil TV series, I am looking forward to seeing what they adapt. However, that is because I feel quite sort of well invested with that series, therefore naturally I'm going to look forward to that. Whereas a brand new show, like I remember when you told me about Altered Carbon, and the way you described it was Blade Runner in a TV series, which is a lot of interpretations you can take from something like that. And I remember watching the first episode and loving it. I thought, this is great. And I never revisited it because it was just one of them things where there wasn't, not necessarily that show didn't have anything to grab me by, because the first episode kind of ends on a cliffhanger. It was just other shows perhaps sort of took over.
It's a heavy meal. It's a heavy meal.
Yeah.
And you have to be ready for that. And you have to watch it at sort of like a 2:30 with a pizza and a beer.
Yeah.
Would you say?
Yeah, it's a nice, not a nice easygoing one where you can just like, yeah, whatever. You kind of need to have a little bit of attention with a show like that.
I agree.
Would you say that like science fiction and fantasy, if it's done really well, as you say, it'll become a heavy hitter. It's going to be like a big blockbuster of a movie or television show. It'd be but if it's done really badly, would you say it's equal to the worst of the B movies?
Yeah. Well, okay, yeah.
It can fall into that trap.
It's really. I mean, bad fantasy is simply unwatchable.
Mm-hmm.
Bad fantasy. I mean, we have the Shannara Chronicles out right now, and the production budget is MTV, by the way. The MTV who makes the Shannara Chronicles.
I didn't know it was
budget,
MTV.
The budget is. I mean, the first season is at least, but the budget is extremely high. The acting is extremely high. John Rhys Davies from Lord of the Rings is in it, and he's probably great. I don't remember his scenes, but it's really great, and it looks fantastic. But then the writing is, for me personally, so utterly contemptuous. It's just so utterly, unbelievably bad. I actually see it as worse because it tried. And I think fantasy is the only genre that can do that. Like, I remember the Last Airbender movie, M. Night Shyamalan's finest work.
No.
And because I'm so familiar with, and I love so much the cartoon, The Last Airbender, or anime, fight me in real life. I was horrified because it was so bad that because he tried. If he was just like, I don't care, and you could tell he wouldn't care if he made something slightly different, but because he genuinely tried to adapt this, it came off so cringeworthy and so terrible. And I think that's the problem with fantasy. It's such high stakes to even exist in the first place because we don't have any chill fantasy. We have The Last Airbender, and that's pretty much it.
It's really interesting you mentioned that about that film in particular, because one of our podcasts in the future is going to be directors changing their speciality and their forte. And someone like Shyamalan, who has done these very mysterious horror films that have gone many different ways, you're taking a property that is loved by so many with the anime, doing it live action. It doesn't always fall on its feet. This is just the way it is. And I think a lot of that is that creative input by a director or by a showrunner. Going back to Lauren Hisrich with The Witcher, works really well. Not so much Shyamalan with a movie.
No.
I don't know who the showrunners are for the Lord of the Rings show that's coming out.
Millionaires.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, man. And they've got some big shoes to fill.
Yeah.
It should be like the Russo brothers at this point.
They actually have 2 cast members from Game of Thrones in that Lord of the Rings show. I can't remember their names, but they have the guy who played Benjen Stark in season 1 of Game of Thrones.
And the second to final season as well. He returns, doesn't he? His cold hands.
Yeah. And then they have young Ned from
Oh, that
wow.
guy outside the Tower of Joy.
Yeah.
That was such a weird casting because it was. I think they like to ADR his voice in, ADR Sean Bean's voice in when they did it, because it just his accent was just so. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this doesn't set up great. I hope he's Frodo. I hope Elijah Wood has to come in.
I want a Yorkshire Frodo.
I hope Elijah Wood has to come in and voice over this guy talking.
Yeah.
It's so good.
If you're listening, Amazon, that's your deal.
Hire us.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. We know what we're doing.
Yeah.
Trust us.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much, guys. That was some really interesting thoughts and conversations there about that. So, what do we have any kind of overall final thoughts on where fantasy television sits within the universe?
Fantasy is the bigger you are, the harder you can fall. But obviously, what we've seen in the past 10 years, if you can just get it right, if you can just try and do well so hard, Jon Favreau, The Witcher, even most of the seasons of Game of Thrones, if you can just appeal to audiences and tell them to let it in, embrace it, it can be brilliant. Fantasy can be amazing, or it can not,
or it can be as bad as a really bad B movie.
Yeah, or it can be worse than the worst B movie. B movies can try. B movies can actually make something enjoyable. I mean, think about even The Room as a B movie. I would put The Room above M. Night Shyamalan's adaptation of The Last Airbender. And you know what? He's still going to make the sequel.
Bring it on, guys.
I'm game.
Well, yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think that fantasy has a special place, and it's a very popular genre within television and film and any kind of platform, really, books and video games alike. But I think with TV, it does have a fight against it, because there are so many down-to-earth dramas and serious political, societal programs that still get shown now, even along with things like action and just science fiction for audiences to enjoy, and that fantasy falls in with them as a subgenre as well, as it does have its own subgenres. So I think it has a lot of pressure on it, definitely. I think it's doing very well in general. I think it'll go through peaks and troughs, but it just needs to keep doing what it's doing overall, and it will remain quite a strong hitter within the television world and against solid competition as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the fantasy genre, the science fiction as well, both of them pretty much the same, but I think, in the last 10 years it's built up a pretty strong following with Game of Thrones, and it's only going to get bigger now. It's only going to get bigger now with Witcher Season 2 next year. There's going to be the Game of Thrones prequel series coming in 2022.
Can't wait.
Think.
Netflix announced an anime Witcher movie recently, didn't they?
Yeah,
which no one knows what it's going to be about yet.
I saw that yesterday.
Legend of the Wolf or something it's called.
more Witcher is good for me.
It's good, yeah.
Especially
I need
for
to
him,
invest in more of this Witcher thing.
Yeah, I think it'll be handy, filling in the gap between the season 1 and the making of season 2. It would be a nice way to transition, I think. Witcher's a good Witcher.
We're all looking forward to that sort of stuff. I mean, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is coming, the next Thor movie's coming, next season The Witcher. There's countless others that are coming. We're all looking forward to it. We hope fantasy doesn't go bad again like the 90s and early 2000s. We want a Highlander remake.
Oh yeah,
good. I would love to see Christopher Lambert come back.
Is he alive? Like, what's going on with him? I haven't seen him in anything.
I do hope so. But Sean Connery needs to come back.
Sean Connery. I don't care what age you are, Sean. You need to come back on for Highlander.
But yeah, I think fantasy can. I think it definitely will get bigger, but I think there is going to be a lot of trips. There is going to be
big shoes to fill.
There's always going to be 3, or it's going to be 2 or 3 golden pieces, but then there's going to be a ton of crap along with it, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree as well. Well, yeah, thanks again, guys.
Thanks, man.
Hope you enjoyed the this week's podcast on fantasy dominance in television. I've been Stu.
I'm Al.
And I'm Matt. And you've been watching 1.5 Degrees.
Thanks very much, guys.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah, like and subscribe.